So I'd like to talk to you today about encompassing provincial monitoring within the national monitoring framework. And I think it follows quite nicely on the two presentations, and there's a lot of synergies. So biodiversity monitoring aims to create indicators that inform biodiversity action. We do this using SANBI, provincial, and partner research, knowledge, and information to derive these indicators. The indicators are then fed into the National Biodiversity Assessment and other reporting mechanisms, both local and international. You might already have seen some of the ecosystem indicators that were shown in the National Biodiversity Assessment of 2011, such as ecosystem threat status and ecosystem protection level. I'll discuss these just now. So SANBI is mandated to monitor and report on the status of the Republic's biodiversity and the conservation status of all listed threatened or protected species and listed ecosystems, as well as the status of all listed invasive species. Quite a tall order. So when considering how to set up the national monitoring framework, SANBI convened a monitoring advisory group. And we began by thinking about how do we define biodiversity. And we decided, well, biodiversity can be defined as having a genetic, species, and ecosystem level. So we decided our indicators in our national monitoring framework would be at genetic, species, and ecosystem level. Now, we've had workshops at each of these levels, and there are working groups that have already started thinking around the methodologies and indicators at each of these levels. So I'm going to share some of that thinking with you. For genetic monitoring, we plan to monitor at short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Now, short-term, in genetic terms, is not the typical short-term you might think of. Short-term genetic projects could inform a management response, but your short-term genetic monitoring project would probably range between 10 and 15 years. Your medium-term genetic monitoring would be able to inform about species resilience to environmental disturbance, but you would expect to have to monitor for at least 20 years. The outputs of a long-term genetic monitoring project are still in draft, but long-term genetic monitoring would be more than 50 years. So if we think about short-term genetic monitoring, the aim there would be to detect genetic erosion and to inform management interventions. But only certain species would be sensitive enough for us to detect this. Priority and control species would be chosen from within and outside protected areas to decrease bias. And just to create a baseline for these studies could take us up to 5 years. There is a pilot study that we're undertaking right now on the Table Mountain ghost frog and Rose's toad, and we've already seen some information on informing management interventions about water abstraction on Table Mountain. When we began thinking about species monitoring, we started by asking ourselves, why do we monitor species? And the answer was twofold. We monitor to understand if threats are getting better or worse, and to understand if the interventions that we're putting in place are actually working. So are we protecting our species? We convened a species workshop in Pretoria in June of 2013, which I think quite a few of you attended. I see some heads nodding. And we asked you these questions, and we broke up into taxonomic groups and discussed what our threats and our interventions were. And we noticed that quite often threats are tied to the red list status of species. So with threats, we will be looking at the red lists and the status of our species. We'll also be looking at the threats recorded for our threatened species. And you can see there from the red list website, habitat loss, invasive alien species, and habitat degradation are our top 3 threats. And that ties in quite well with Mandy's slide on the threats with fishing. However, red list status only gives you a point in time status right now of how threatened our species are. The IUCN has offered a red list index approach to to give us a trend on our species becoming more threatened or less threatened over time. So we hope to implement that into the future as well. When it comes to species protection, we begin by looking at our protected areas and our species populations. And we look at, do our species populations enjoy some form of protection? And you can see just a portion of a map that was presented by Lisa van Staden at the Biodiversity Planning Forum in 2013, showing a heat map of the species populations and the protected areas. In the species workshop, it was also noted by the participants that CITES, TOPS, and biodiversity management plans were also interventions that helped to protect our species. So we'll be using that information in our monitoring as well. You also heard that SANBI is mandated to monitor invasive species, and that is now driven by the Alien and Invasive Species Regulations. A national status report on alien and invasive species is due within 3 years from the 1st of October 2014. That's when those regulations came into force. Also mandated by these regulations are management plans for alien and invasive species. And the controls implemented in those plans can be monitored to see how well we are controlling our alien and invasive species. Already in this symposium, I have heard discussions on new techniques to monitor our alien and invasive species, and we've heard some presentations on these techniques as well, such as fixed point photography, range prediction using models, and remote sensing of certain species, such as Parthenium. When it comes to ecosystem monitoring, we look at our ecosystems in different environments, such as terrestrial, rivers, wetlands, estuaries, coastal and inshore, and offshore. However, we follow roughly the same methodology in our two indicators, namely ecosystem threat status and ecosystem protection level. In ecosystem threat status, we consider the ecosystem pressures that each of the ecosystems faces. We look at the threatened plant species and animal species in those ecosystems and consider the priority areas that the provinces or local authorities have managed to list in their various biodiversity plans. When it comes to ecosystem protection levels, we look at the classified ecosystems and what protection they enjoy. Now, reality is that with ecosystem threat status, and in part ecosystem protection level, and even with red listing, what underlies this is what's actually happening on the ground. And so what SANBI is busy doing is creating a habitat modification layer. Don't laugh, Mandy. The habitat modification layer stemmed from discussions at the Biodiversity Planning Forum, and a working group got together with SANBI staff, partners, and provinces to discuss the different classes and methodology and data sets that could be used in creating this layer. So I'll show you the classes in a second. So how we created this layer was to take the different land covers from the provinces that had them and reclassify them to the classes, of course in communication with the provinces. With the areas that didn't have any data, we used the latest in different vector layers and used those to create our classes. So let's take a quick look. We're going to zoom into that red block. And we'll take a closer look again. Now, what we're busy doing at the moment is we're trying to create a confidence level for you. So because we've got so many different layers, we're busy doing statistical analysis on this data to sample it and give you a confidence rating on the data so that when you use it in your analysis, you can quote our statistical analysis as well. So there are your classes. We've got natural areas, which are primary natural areas, degraded natural areas, and secondary natural areas. We've got cultivation, dry land, and irrigated cultivation, plantations, natural water bodies and artificial water bodies, roads, urban or built-up areas, low-density settlements, non-natural urban spaces, and mines. And I see So hopefully you've already seen yourself participating in the different areas. Perhaps you're already in one of the working groups, either for red listing or vegetation mapping, or you're busy with some of the NBA. Perhaps you've participated in the species workshop. There will be more workshops coming up. But I do very much encourage you to collaborate with us and interact with us. And I really would encourage your input as well. So please do feel free to contact me, find me during tea or lunch. And thank you very much.